What's up YouTube? It's Australia Duel Masters coming at you with this deck profile today. So we're actually going to try our best to replicate a cult classic and build a deck around one of the most coveted cards in the TCG. So we are reviewing Death Phoenix Avatar of Doom today. So this card is very interesting because if we take Death Phoenix at face value on its own, it's ridiculously powerful. It costs only 4 mana, has 9,000 power, and is double breaker. And when it breaks your opponent's shields, they go directly to the graveyard, exactly like Bolmedius. And then when Death Phoenix leaves the battle zone, your opponent must discard their hand, so a nice lost soul effect. The problem is though that Firebirds and Zombie Dragons are required to evolve Death Phoenix. The challenge is that while Firebirds aren't as bad, Zombie Dragons are not great. So we essentially have a bit of trouble with the bait we have to use to get Death Phoenix out. So our challenge today is to come up with a deck that is playable whilst remaining somewhat competitive, and to be truthful, that is a great challenge. So over the course of the past few weeks, I've spent numerous hours thinking about what Death Phoenix deck would be having the most potential to be competitive, and a lot of cards did come into my mind over that time. So initially I thought about running Nature in the build to ramp mana with Fairy Life and Bronze Arm Tribe, etc. But to be truthful, I feel like mana ramp isn't needed for this deck because it's technically possible that you could have Death Phoenix out by turn 5 if you get the right card draw. So obviously it wouldn't happen very often, but nonetheless it is possible. Then I thought about the Threat of Rush, which could be a big problem as this is a slower paced deck. And that's why I thought about the likes of Tornado Flame, Terror Pit, etc. to be, those counters to Rush. And I also did consider, running Skeetos to block those early Gaunters and Breaklaws, etc. Then you begin to think about facing control builds, which heavily feature and favour discard options. And to be honest, there isn't a whole lot you can do about discard other than running a few copies of Zombie Carnival to help retrieve back the pieces that you've lost due to the discard. So this is the type of deck that really struggles coming up against discard, as you cannot afford to be losing your key pieces of this deck, otherwise it just will not work. Then I began to think about, could this deck work solely as a Fire and Darkness deck? And the answer is yes. But again, it will be a slower paced deck and won't be able to keep up with the pace of Rush. If you're going to keep this deck solely as Fire and Darkness, you'd want to be running, max copies of Terror Pit, Proclamation of Death, 10-Ton Crunch, Tornado Flame, to, increase the chances of hitting shield triggers to destroy your opponent's creatures in the early game, early aggro. So you'd want to be running, 4 copies of Bloody Skeeto to counter those early Breaklaws and Gaunters, as I mentioned before. If you don't have the Skeetos, Marrow Ooze would be sufficient. Another card, you'd need to run is Gigapi Ponto to be able to take out those higher powered weenies that, could potentially take out your Coco Lupias and so forth, which if you don't deal with, it'll hinder your ability to be able to get Death Phoenix out. I thought about, adding discard options to the build such as Ghost Touch and Cranium Clamp, but I feel like more than anything, this actually takes us away from the objective and playstyle we want to be achieving to get out Death Phoenix. Instead, we should be focusing on what we need to do to our opponent, not what we can do to our opponent. So what I mean by all that is we're actually wanting our opponent to have a big hand so that they think twice about destroying your Death Phoenix. Because if they do, obviously we know they're going to lose their entire hand. So I believe the better play is to keep your focus on the long-term play of having their hand discarded once Phoenix is destroyed, as this is a much more effective method in the long run than chipping away at them with Ghost Touches and Cranium Clamps. So nevertheless, I was determined to create a build for Death Phoenix that is both playable and somewhat competitive, and the only way I could achieve this, I believe, is by adding the Water Civilization into the deck. Yes, I know it's conventional and it's a tad boring, as we tend to see the same water cards in decks, but that's because they work time and time again and they serve a purpose that is unrivaled. So the reason why we have to add water into this build is because it improves our defense, it improves our draw power, and it improves our overall consistency. I did delve into some card search options such as crystal memory, but discovered that these actually hinder the deck rather than support it, because the reality is we don't actually have time to search out cards we're needing, as this deck has to be played relatively fast to be any chance at securing victory. We cannot waste any turns. So this, my friends, is where our deck profile today kicks off. Sorry for the super long intro. There's just a lot to cover and a lot of thoughts that were going through my mind to making this deck. So I'm so glad you've joined us for this one. Strap yourselves in because it's going to be a very bumpy ride. We're going to get some high speeds out of this one. So we kick the deck off with a playset of Kook Palon. So Kook is a 2-drop 1000 powered firebird that cannot be attacked, which means that your opponent must use creature removal to deal with Kook. More often than not, Kook can be very difficult to remove in the early game, and they're spending precious mana that they'd otherwise be wanting to spend on, spamming out creatures early. So next we have 3 copies of Tornado Flame for shield trigger goodness and to help take out those early threats in the game. Obviously, we are more hoping for these to be played as shield triggers, so we don't have to pay the mana. We then run 3 copies of Bloody Skeeto to counter early aggro and rush, and Skeeto is our only means of early defense, so they are critical pieces if we are to remain any chance at staying in the game, until we can, have enough momentum to swing the game in our favor. So next we have a playset of Necro Dragon Galand. Obviously, as we know, zombie dragons are trash, but we are running 4 copies of Galand because it is one of the cheapest zombie dragons outside of Zelva, and we want to try and cheat out Death Phoenix as early as possible, and running 4 copies of Galand is our best chance at doing that. We then have 2 copies of Necro Dragon Jagravine, which is a 6-cost 6000 powered zombie dragon blocker, which has double breaker ability, but once it dies, it dies once it is blocked. So yeah, this is an example of another pretty poor card, but a key piece we need for Death Phoenix. Next we have 2 copies of Zombie Carnival. So this is a really nice retrieval piece in the deck if we need to get back those key pieces that may have been discarded by our opponent or destroyed by our opponent earlier on in the game. So we've opted for Zombie Carnival as it has its shield trigger ability and can obtain 1 more creature back compared to Morbid Medicine. It is a far better option in this deck and increases our shield trigger count to a reasonable amount as well. So we've also decided to run 4 copies of Terrapit to remove, potential threats to Death Phoenix, included disruption to our Firebirds and Zombie Dragons. We definitely want to see Terrapit come up in our shields. We then have included 3 copies of Aqua Hulkus to increase our draw power and to build some early game board presence. Next we have 3 copies of Aqua Surfer. Again, we are hoping to see these in our shield zone if we're facing rush and aggro style decks from our opponent. Surfer can act as that buffer that we need to just get that extra turn or extra time to set your opponent back a bit. We then run 3 copies of Coral, so this is a means to try and stall our opponent and to set them back a turn because we are time poor and in our deck, and Coral is a great way to give us the extra time we need to pull off our combos. We are running 2 copies of Brain Serum to increase our shield trigger count and in the hopes that we don't have to spend the mana to draw 2 cards. So Brain Serum acts as another draw power method that we can utilize. Next we have 2 copies of Miraculous Meltdown. So Meltdown is our Hail Mary, so to speak. If we have come up against an aggressive deck, Meltdown gives us a chance to level the playing field and get even with our opponent. Because this deck is slow, Meltdown is our way of counteracting rush and aggro strategies, and Meltdown can come up clutch in the right moments for sure. Lastly, we run 3 copies of Death Phoenix Avatar of Doom. So Death Phoenix costs 4 mana, has 9000 power, is double breaker, and when it breaks your opponent's shields, they go to the graveyard like Bolmedius. And then when Death Phoenix leaves the battle zone, your opponent must discard their entire hand. Now, getting Death Phoenix out into the battle zone is very challenging, but once it's out there, there is very little your opponent can actually do, as they don't want to lose their hand, but you force them to do so if they want to get rid of the threat. You want to try and keep your opponent with a large hand as well, so that they think twice about targeting Death Phoenix. So here's an overview of the deck and how many copies of each card we are running in this build. We've now reached the part of the video where we're going to talk about game plan. So this is where we go through and explain the deck mechanics turn by turn and what you want to be doing with this deck at what stage. Now, obviously, it's worth noting that things don't always go to plan due to the unpredictability of card draw and so forth. But this is just a guide for what the perfect game plan would look like if you're getting the right card draw. So turn 1 is charging mana or drawing a card if you're going second. Turn 2 is summoning Kukpalon or Bloody Skeeto to block early aggro and rush. Turn 3 is summoning Aqua Hulkus to draw a card, or Coco Lupia. Turn 4 is summoning Galand or casting Brain Serum to draw 2 cards. Turn 5 is summoning Death Phoenix, casting Zombie Carnival to retrieve key pieces, or summoning Coral to put your opponent back a turn. So we'll now just review some cards that can be used as a substitute if you would like to change anything from the build. These are some suggestions you could consider. So if you're struggling getting past blockers, you could include some copies of Critical Blade, which destroys any one of your opponent's blockers of any power level, so there's no restrictions there. I really wanted to include Comet Missile in this deck, but it came up just short, unfortunately. Depending on the deck you're facing, though, you could definitely consider swapping it in. I like that it's a shield trigger, only costs 1 mana, and can remove, pretty much the majority of the blockers in the game to allow you to swing for shields and potentially the game. The last card I desperately wanted to find room for was Spiral Gate, as it's a powerful shield trigger. It sends a creature in the battle zone back to its opponent's hand, like Coral. It essentially puts your opponent back a turn, as they will need to re-spend the mana to put the exact same creature out the next turn. Meanwhile, you're focusing on continuing to build the game on your terms. So that just about covers and wraps up this deck profile. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you found this deck profile very interesting. I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments on the build, or if you have a Death Phoenix build, I'd love to see your lists, so please feel free to share them below in the comments section for some discussion. As always, please remember to like, subscribe and share this video with DM players around the world. We're trying our best to engage with the worldwide community and do our part to contribute to the relevance of this beautiful game as well. If you've seen this video and you're from Australia, feel free to join our Australia Duel Masters Facebook group. Until next time, Duel Masters fans, Australia Duel Masters out. Peace.